All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the People and Pollinators Action Network March webinar, a deep dive into the Colorado Native Pollinating Insects Health Study, or as we like to call it for short, the Insect Study, the study, Pollinating Insect Study. Anyways, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for People and Pollinators Action Network. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we try to hold one every month with a different speaker. So be sure to sign up for our e-news and check out our events calendar to keep up to date with these upcoming webinars. And we've got a great presentation prepared for you. But first, we just wanted to tell you a little bit more about us. So we are People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN, the host of this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. For instance, PPAN played a leading role in the legislation that made the Colorado Native Pollinating Insects Health Study possible. And we also do a lot of organizing around community mobilization and habitat creation. And there really are a lot of reasons to do this work, but one of my favorite fast facts from the Pollinating Insects Study is that Colorado has an extremely diverse butterfly community and is home to over 40% of the diversity of butterflies in North America, north of Mexico. So today we are really happy to have two co-authors of and experts of the Native Pollinating Insects Health Study to speak. So first we have Dr. Adrian Carper, who is a community ecologist who helped lead the statewide scientific review of the Native Pollinating Insects Study. He has studied pollinators in Colorado from the mountains to the plains and has worked with agencies, municipalities, organizations, and many vested communities interested in pollinator conservation. His current research through the Museum of Natural History focuses on impacts of human land use on native bee community ecology and how natural history knowledge can help inform their conservation. In the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, he focuses on butterflies and the impacts of exotic plants on the chemical ecology of multi-trophic interactions.
I'll print it and you can look at it.
We also have Steve Armstead with us today. Steve is a pollinator conservation and nature-based climate solutions specialist for the Xerces Society working in Colorado. And his position focuses on front range efforts to coordinate, manage, and build high quality, connected, climate resilient pollinator habitat. Steve is also a co-author of the study and led the assessment and development of best management practices. He also has extensive experience working in natural lands management, environmental planning, and community engagement through his prior 3-decade career with the City of Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Parks program. Steve also holds a master's degree in museum and field studies from the University of Colorado Boulder, where he studied and surveyed butterflies, and he has remained an active butterfly enthusiast. So the study really has a lot of broad implications for our state and our pollinators. As you can see, it has a scientific review, conservation practices, and future priorities for pollinator management. Like we said, PPAN, along with our pollinator champions at the Capitol, played a leading role in the creation of the legislation that made this study possible. And in fact, this study is the most robust and detailed account of pollinator health ever undertaken in the history of Colorado, and it is unique nationally. As a result of recommendations of the study, new policy implications are already taking root in our legislation that we will touch on a little bit later. And this study is also greatly contributing to PPAN's educational outreach efforts. And we will be releasing a pollinator map that spotlights different insects through the state and providing more educational materials based on the study's research. So here's just a sneak peek of that pollinator map that came as a result of this study. And we actually got the same artist, Faith Williams Tristan, who did the illustrations for the cover of the insect study to help out with these illustrations as well. And with this page, you can kind of see, where certain pollinators are located geographically in the state. And then you can also roll over them and get some more information about them. So in general, just be sure to keep an eye out for all of the amazing work that is being done as a result of this study. All right, thank you everyone. And as a reminder, please stay muted, leave your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. And we also really encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series. And this donation would also support PPAN's education, advocacy, and habitat creation efforts coming up this spring. A donation of any size really does make a difference, so thank you so much for your consideration. And I will put a link in the chat to make it easy for people. So that being said, thank you all, and I will pass it over to Dr. Carper.
Thanks so much. Hopefully everybody's seeing the right screen. Okay, thanks a lot for those great introductions to Anna Gray. And I think Steve and I like to use this opportunity to give what we call an in-depth overview of the study. And yet even with 30 or 40 minutes, this is still really going to be a high level kind of walkthrough of what the study is. So a big thank you to PPAN and all of its members who helped to get this study passed through legislation, right? You're the ones that actually work to get the bill passed, signed into law, the DNR put in a request for proposals, and then we built a really highly collaborative team and put in a proposal that said we would be the best group of people to do this kind of overview. And I just want to start out by saying a big thank you to our collaborative team. And one of those isn't here today, and that's Darren Davidson, who's with CSU Extension. She did all of the legwork in overseeing this project. So while Steve and I wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages, she was there cracking the whip behind us just to make sure that it all got done. And that's an invaluable service to this project. And you'll hear from Steve later, who really led up all of the land management team. And my role in all of this was to really oversee what we called the science team to review what we know about the science behind pollinators in Colorado. And I just wanted to underscore what a huge undertaking this was in a very short period of time. And so the final report ended up being over 300 pages long. It includes, 64 pages of the scientific review, over 100 pages of Xerces Society's conservation practices. And even outside the main parts of the study, the appendices contain tons of information. If you're interested about our rare and imperiled pollinators, or where to find references for the study that we talk about. For sure, if you're looking through this, don't overlook the appendices because there's a lot of really useful information in there. So, sorry, forgot my animations. And so that was our main team, but as I'm sure Steve will also point out, we had a tremendous amount of support, both from our own organizations and from the scientific community. And so, for instance, the scientific review, which I'm going to be talking about, had well over a dozen Colorado-specific pollinators who helped us interpret the studies for which they actually were a part, as well as global syntheses of all the mechanisms that drive our pollinators. So a big shout out to everybody who helped. And so what we're going to do is just kind of walk you through kind of the study. It covers more material than we can do in one webinar, but we're going to try to hit the highlights of this and tell you what we think are the main takeaways and concepts that you need to know about what the study means. And so if you're reading this thing, highly recommend you take the time to go through the executive summary, which really condenses all of it down to a really easily digestible metric for most people. The first section is the introduction, which just has background information on the report, what it took to get into it in terms of, say, like a scientific review. So what kind of studies went into it, and what our target audiences were, which was basically state agencies. And yet we also really wanted this to be readable by the general public and make sure that the concepts that we are presenting to our government were also applicable to what you guys were interested in. So my big job was the scientific review. And so the first thing that we wanted to point out was just how important our pollinators were in Colorado. And so we scoured for a whole bunch of agricultural statistics on the valuation of, say, pollinator-dependent crops to show that our native pollinators were worth billions of dollars to our agriculture in Colorado. Not only the pollinator-dependent crops like our Rocky Ford cantaloupes or Paeonia peaches, which are worth tens of millions of dollars per year, but also to crops which benefit from pollination like beans and alfalfa, which make more seed if they get visited by native pollinators, all of which also contribute to our livestock industry and our healthy rangelands, which are valued at over $5 billion a year. These are big numbers, right, in terms of the value that our wild pollinators provide to our agricultural economy. And yet those are probably paled in comparison to the natural value of our pollinators because our natural ecosystems depend on them for healthy ecosystem services and function, which also drives our recreational tourism industry, right? And so people pay a lot of money to visit our beautiful alpine mountains and do crazy things like my wife there looking at high alpine flowers, right? All of those depend on our native pollinators. And yet we're really worried about them because the evidence is showing that they're not doing so well. So you've often heard probably that insects have declined by 50% over the past few decades. Here's data from the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab showing over the past 35 years that there are half as many insects today as there was when David Inouye started collecting this data. And for some species, we know that those are particularly problematic. So if you look at bumblebees, for instance, bumblebees have been declining across their range in many instances. The Western bumblebee, if you look at the colors, all you need to interpret for these maps are 20, 30 years ago where they were distributed, darker colors, there were lots of bumblebees. Lighter colors nowadays, there's fewer of them, and they're modeled to nearly completely disappear by 2050, unless something changes. And this is really alarming because Colorado has 24 bumblebee species. That's about 10% of the global diversity of bumblebees, and nearly a fifth of them, 20%, are currently petitioned or under reviewed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for federal protections, right? So that means we're at the forefront of the global biodiversity crisis right now in Colorado. So in and amongst all of this really depressing scientific data on how bad things are, we also try to highlight where good things are, like the fact that we have one of the most biodiverse communities of pollinators on the planet, with nearly 40% of North American diversity of butterflies and 5% of the entire global diversity of wild bees, and included lots of pretty pictures from our museum of just how diverse they are, but also highlighted comparatively what that meant in terms of how much we know compared to other groups. So when you look at the amount of data that's available to make conservation decisions on things like birds, this aves is all birds, most of all of our distributional knowledge of animals comes from birds. And when you look at the proportion of data we have on insects, it's comparatively tiny, right? And so these are all different kinds of insect groups, and the data that we have is mostly for beetles and butterflies and bees, and comparatively much less for things like our flies or other insects, which could be acting as pollinators. And so it's really alarming that for the data we do have that shows negative like trends, we still know so little about so many other groups. And so the biggest part of the scientific review was really was really focused on an overview of what mechanisms are driving those declines and what we can do about it. And so without a doubt, habitat loss is the biggest thing that has driven loss of biodiversity around the globe and in Colorado. And you might not know this, but Colorado is at the forefront of agricultural intensification. So when you look across the entire United States, all of this blue color that you see is cropland that has historically, for the past 50 years, been cropland. Anywhere you see warm colors here in orange or red is new cropland, things that didn't used to be plowed and turned into crops. And Colorado's, especially on our west slope, is actually getting more and more cropland. and that's a permanent conversion away from a natural habitat to an agricultural crop. And that's a little alarming. 16% of Colorado is already cropland. And if you consider our ranged lands, that means 50% of the state is agricultural use, right? And so while that represents arguably necessary habitat loss to keep us alive because we need crops and farms, how we manage those crops and farms can have positive impacts. And so doing things like planting conservation easements in farms in less productive land has been shown to benefit native pollinators. And so what we really need doing is finding out how we can do more of that. The second biggest driver of habitat loss is urbanization. And so anybody who's seen growth along the Front Range knows that more and more people are coming to Colorado, and more rural and agricultural land even is being converted into our urban centers. And this is really problematic because there's not many flowers, there's urban heat, there's even what's called ALAN, artificial light at night. All of these things have been shown to have negative impacts on pollinator communities. But what's good is that it also means that there's opportunity to have conservation practices. And so creating more green spaces creates refuges for pollinators. It's been shown that connecting those green spaces across urban corridors is a way to connect populations of vulnerable pollinators. And so what we really ought to be doing in our urban areas is thinking about ways to improve habitat quality by reducing our pesticides, mitigating the impacts of urban heat and light, and by fostering native pollinators by planting native plants and creating nest sites for them. We also tried to, since this was geared towards the state government, focus on different aspects of management and what research has shown can help mitigate things like habitat loss. And so our forests are pretty unique in terms of where research has been done because they're mostly coniferous. And coniferous forests typically aren't that great for bees, but their understories are. And so management things that help create open canopies and more floriferous understories can actually be really good for our pollinators. And so this means that our agencies could have some dual purpose in doing things like prescribed fire or thinning because it can help mitigate fire risk while fostering more diverse pollinator communities. But we put this big caveat that not a whole lot of research has been done. And what we really should be doing is investing in more research to know how our forest management can best support pollinators. Probably don't have to tell all you guys that pesticides are bad. They're poisons. We design them to kill things, and they do. And they can often have non-target effects. There's very little debate in the scientific community about the global negative impacts of not only insecticides, but herbicides and fungicides on pollinating insects. And all three have been found in both wild and managed pollinators here in Colorado and in concentrations that have negative health impacts. Beyond finding them there, very little research in Colorado has explored how it changes our pollinator communities or just how at risk they are. And so we really do need to focus on having more studies of just how ubiquitous pesticides are and what risks they pose. Well, let me go back. We also touched on some really controversial topics like non-native plants and pollinators. In terms of non-native plants, as you can tell from this bumblebee on a thistle, our native pollinators use them quite readily. And so studies have gone back and forth on the impacts of non-native plants on pollinators because they are a floral resource. And so the impacts of non-native plants are probably much more systemic on the ecosystem and dependent on a whole lot of things like the degree of invasion, what kind of control strategy is used to try to mitigate their invasion, and their impacts on native pollinators. But very little research has been done within the state on non-native pollinators. And we do have a lot, from butterflies to bees. There's 11 different non-native bee species in Colorado, for instance. And yet most of these bees are accidental introductions, which, so as far as we know, have little impact on the community. Others probably do. And so we tried to conceptualize this in terms of the risk associated with different non-native species. And so there was a really good paper that categorized risk basically based off of whether or not species were managed and introduced and how social they were. So if you're working with a native species, not an introduced, that's managed, Solitary managed species like the blue orchard bee probably pose few risks relative to other non-native species because their populations are small, only one female makes a nest, and while they have the potential to do things like alter gene flow, they're probably not really being competitive with other native species. As compared to non-native or introduced bee species, like honeybees, which are highly social, forage on tons of resources, have been shown to vector diseases and compete with native species. And so beyond this, along this continuum, you can start to categorize how worried you should be about any individual non-native pollinator. By far, climate change is probably one of the most impactful things on our native pollinators because it's impacting not only pollinators, but also the plants on which they depend. And a lot of the information that we know about climate change in Colorado comes from the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Crested Butte, where we've shown that things like bumblebees are now emerging 2 weeks earlier on average and have moved 250 meters higher. That's over 800 feet higher in elevation over the past 50 years. And at the same time, the plants on which they depend have not moved, but are now flowering nearly a month and a half earlier because of earlier dates of snowmelt. And what this has created is an instance where our plants and our pollinators are now no longer connected across our high alpine environments, and it can have ecosystem-wide impacts on the stability of our plant pollinator networks. And so that's really alarming. And so we wrapped up the scientific review by really talking about what we as scientists saw as the state of Colorado's pollinating insects, which we phrased as being tenuous, because we have one of the most diverse communities in the world right here. And yet, even in some of our most protected areas like our high alpine environments, those communities are under stress from human-induced environmental change. And I asked the scientists who contributed to this to rank what they thought was the most negatively impactful factor on our native pollinators. And you can see here the rank from one on the left over to those that are less impactful on the right. And climate change ranked as the #1 thing that's negatively impacting our pollinators, followed really closely by the drivers of habitat loss, agricultural intensification, urbanization, and then also pesticides and how we manage our our public lands. And then less so do we know from the evidence the impacts of our managed pollinators, introduced diseases, or our non-native plants and pollinators. And this is kind of the opposite of what we see about our gaps in our scientific understanding. And our biggest gaps in those impacts is driven by those managed pollinators, how much they're competing. We know they can, we just don't know the degree to which they do. We know they can vector diseases, we just don't know how much those vector diseases impact our native pollinators here in Colorado. And so these are real areas where we need to study more. We also finished out that section with ranking what scientists thought was the most potential for policy at the state level, which could have positive impacts by mitigating these factors. And as you might expect, pesticides are right up, right? Because they have such a negative impact and they're so policy specific, that would be an area where you could have an impact. And conversely, things like climate change, which are global problems, are much harder to have a state level impact on our pollinators because it really requires coordinated effort across lots of different levels of government. So just wanted to end with that's what we use to kind of build these priorities along with Xerces for our state agencies. And just wanted to highlight that we also say that we as scientists and researchers are there for our agencies and the public as resources for anybody interested in conserving our pollinators. So hopefully I didn't go too long. I think that's all I have. I'll hand it over to Steve now.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Hopefully now we've switched effectively to a new set of slides, and it's just similar as to way Adrian set up the science just in this presentation. It's really, to me, it's a phenomenal part of the report, the work that Adrian and all the scientists that were involved, you know, compiled so much information and in a rich way that really helps frame the rest of the report, which is really setting in context, okay, what can we do? Here are what we know about our pollinators, some of those threats that they are facing, but there are actions we can take that help to mitigate some of those threats, or maybe help to improve the habitat and the conditions that help them thrive. And so the component that Xerces, and frankly, a lot of different Xerces staff that work across the country and work with a lot of different environments, work with land managers from scales down to individual working land managers up to larger agencies, and also in collaboration with many state staff, representatives of the various state agencies that all.
Oh, Steve, you muted for some reason.
Unmute, sorry, I'll pick up. Is that better?
That's perfect, thanks.
Okay, great. And so, you know, we also collaborated with the state's representatives from state agencies that many of these practices are relevant to, and certainly the programs and policies. So, you know, the feedback and the information presented in these management practices really are kind of very broad based, both from kind of generalized knowledge and expertise, but also very directed to the environments that they're going to be working on. And so, you know, from kind of setting up the management and the policy, we wanted to start, because we have this wealth of information in the science section, to really provide some broader principles to kind of connect a little bit of the science with some of those actions that we think and should keep in mind when we, you know, start doing activities that could have implications for pollinators. And so we start out with just some general conservation practices, and then dive more deeply into specific management practices that are relevant for our state agencies, whether that's Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture. So, you know, really land management activities, and then take time to really assess what is the state currently doing that has policy and program benefits for pollinators, and where are some of the gaps, and what could we recommend they could be doing better. And then we kind of wrap all this up thinking about management and policy implications to science, and set the stage for where should we go from here? Where can we recommend that the state kind of put their emphasis and focus on to think about how do we do better to protect our pollinators and their health. There we go. And so just from a general considerations, there's kind of, you know, and I won't go into depth on these, and I do encourage you kind of read this section, because it really applies across a broad range of scales. And I think that's, as Adrian mentioned, is one of the real benefits here for of this report, is it really is directed to the state, but has applicability for all sorts of scales, whether that's a local government, whether that's an individual who's just looking in around the space they may have access to, of what can you do better. So just thinking about broad principles always are really important in the relationship of actions you can take. So as an example, there is just, no matter what space you have responsibility for, is there may be potential in that space to already be providing habitat for pollinators. So already forage or nesting conditions or shelter resources. So identification is an important component. And then once you know about something, taking actions to help manage, conserve, protect that space. In so doing that, you might actually create a refuge for other spaces that, as improvements may occur, that can help, you know, make a connection between habitats, which then expands the availability of habitat between spaces, and or look for where there's gaps in ways we can make connections. So thinking about existing habitats, ways to expand, create, and connect habitats. Adrian mentioned this with the science. You know, we certainly want to be thoughtful about in how we manage invasive plants and managed pollinators, and there's components there that are important. And no matter what, kind of a theme that always is critical with pollinator conservation is the timing of what we do and when we do it really is important for pollinators. So thinking about, you know, trying to minimize or mitigate actions that occur when pollinators are being most active, whether that's a caterpillar when it's foraging on its host plant, or an adult butterfly or bee, you know, foraging and nectaring or grabbing pollen from a flower. So the timing really is critical. And then also always thinking about kind of the compounding or interaction between management stresses. We know our pollinators are already addressing threats through climate change and drought and large scale issues, but then we complicate that with actually putting actions on a ground that may cause further stresses. So thinking about that is critical. And then adaptive management, whether that's kind of in a more formal sense from an agency where they're perhaps doing more rigorous study to understand a condition and then what might be changing based upon a management prescription, to just our own observations when we do things. I plant these flowers, and how does that change the landscape around me, and what works better and what works worse for creating better habitat. So the general consideration section really provides kind of a high level overview, which then sets up for the section of the report that really guides management actions that are relevant for our state agencies. But again, some of these are very applicable at many other scales or for many other purposes. And I won't go through kind of all 8. That's kind of much too deep of a dive to go to, but I did want to highlight a few of those that I thought were interesting and kind of give you a sense of kind of the depth of information here. So the first one I just wanted to touch on, and kind of Adrian again set within the science section, that that how we manage our forests here in Colorado can have big implications for our pollinators, and is important, whether that's because we're doing want to do a lot of work to help our forest conditions be healthier. We're going to be doing a lot of work too to manage and think about the fire risks within our forests. But it's also just not thinking about forests, but woodlands and shrublands and trees in our urban environments or on our riparian corridors. All are important components of providing habitat. So how we manage those can have big implications for our pollinators. And so there are common, well-prescribed practices that make a difference for pollinators in providing, forage resources, nesting, and shelter resources for many of our pollinators that are woody in nature. And so how we deal with those can make a difference. So thinking about the health of our forest, the more we manage for diverse species, diverse age classes within our forests, we actually create conditions that are often very favorable for many of our pollinators. So there's a strong alignment usually between good forest practices and therefore managing conditions that are more favorable for pollinators. And part of that too, as Adrian mentioned, that maybe a lot of our coniferous forests aren't the best, tree resource for pollinators, but the floral resources on the ground can be incredibly important. So thinking about how we maintain openings within our forests so that there's sunlight and conditions that can grow some of the shrubs and the grasses and forbs below, certainly do provide excellent habitat for pollinators. So, thinking about the patches and openness and the placement of those patches is important. Whether it's in a forest environment or frankly, just even along a roadside or maybe just at the edge of a woodland, how we manage kind of the transition between a treed area and a non-treed area is actually pretty important for pollinators. So recommendation there is to think about never kind of trying to avoid having this wall suddenly transition of trees, but to think about kind of feathering or softening forest edge. So there's a diversity of trees, there's diversity of height, and maybe not a consistent wall of tree, but kind of gaps in some sort of if you want to think about it, rough edge to a forest, which allows diversity within that space for pollinators. Just similar as a benefit for wildlife in general, certainly birds leaving snags and trees with cavities serve all similar purposes for many of our cavity nesting bees, and the importance therefore, providing nest resources. Similarly, whether that's in a standing snag or woody debris on the ground, all very relevant and important resources. And you can think about this in a forest management landscape down to the individual spaces in around our homes or our parks where we have tree resources. And for the managers, then this is also an important component that when we think about managing our forests, that within our management plans we integrate pollinator considerations and pollinator best practices into those management plans itself. The other topic I want to just touch base on is the integrated pest management and pesticide risk reduction section. And so there's kind of a broader approach just looking at pesticides and best practices, and I won't delve into this, but there's a similar suite of recommendations just around weed management and herbicides. And so, between the two sections, you really get kind of very broad-based and detailed information about best practices related to both. But just even dealing with kind of the integrated pest management section, you get the general understanding of the recommendations and the practices there in terms of, no matter what, understanding if you have a problem and kind of having an ability to understand, is that problem worth taking an action, is a critical thing to be thinking about. And so having tools in place to identify a problem and then know if that problem is worth taking action around is kind of a key step to take in terms of, addressing is it worthwhile, and what are the best types of mechanical and or chemical practices that might be needed. If there is a choice to look and use a chemical prevention, thinking about, first, are there non-chemical options that should be and could be tried? And if not, then thinking about, okay, what are the best targeted and appropriate pesticides to apply? Is it something that can be very selective to the situation you're facing? Is it going to have a short life? And also is ideally least toxic as possible. And then also thinking about the practices that you're applying chemicals to make sure, you're mitigating any risks in their use, reducing any sort of drift or off-site movement, making sure you're planning the timing of application to minimize or mitigate any direct exposure to pollinators. So again, trying to avoid where there's floral or food resources, especially those that are preferred by our native pollinators. And then having it put in a context of a integrated plan, whether that's a pest management plan or ideally a pollinator pest management plan, are all kind of associated best practices. The other kind of practice or a suite of management actions I wanted to kind of just highlight, because I think they have applicability again between what I know a lot of you already do and know about, is how do you kind of help to nurture back landscapes that have probably been degraded in some extent, and or create new landscapes where perhaps previously there hasn't been a landscape, or you're trying to convert it from a less natural landscape into something more natural. And so that has applicability for us around our homes, to our parks, as well as for many of the state agencies. And so best practices there, and again, I know I'm speaking kind of aligns to what you all already are quite familiar with, is thinking about how do we prioritize native plants and local ecotypes and any sort of planting or revegetation efforts that take place, and thinking about overlapping and sequential blooms to make sure there's floral resources throughout a season. Thinking about the right plant in the right place, putting something that's compatible with the local soils and micro conditions. Consider, how's that vegetation going to be sustained given, the future of resilience for climate and changing conditions for that site. And then also, thinking too, and this is relative to the state, is that, there's a lot of different conditions for which the state can manage creating habitat, whether that's along roadsides or within managed landscapes, and also in nurturing back even conditions that may not be ideal in some of our better protected state parks or other wildlife areas. So beyond the management practices, we also, engaged with the state employees, both through surveys and also direct interviews, to really understand what the state is currently doing that are both related to the practices and also programs and policies. And from that, we provided kind of an overview in the report about some of those existing programs and policies, which it's great to say that the state is doing some things that I think are making a difference. The work along the I-76 and the Pollinator Highway project has made a difference for miles of stretches along roadway, both from kind of introducing habitat, but also improving the visibility of those stretches with some of our native plants. Thinking about in the CDOT having requirements that encourage and or require the use of native plants in some of their restoration projects is a huge advantage. Programs such as the State Natural Areas Program, and making sure those programs, which are vital for recognizing conservation measures for some of our rare plants, also think about the ways they could connect to, providing those same kind of resources for some of our rare and imperiled pollinators. And then programs like the State Wildlife Action Plan, are certainly ways to recognize and help pull information to bear about some of our more at risk or imperiled species and threats they face and what we can do to pay attention to them. And then other aspects such as the greening the government orders, which have come out sequentially over the last couple of years, are important around fighting some of the bigger topics, like how do we do efforts to address climate change? Are there things that the state can do in its own operations that make a difference? So, so there are good programs existing within the state, but there's also opportunities to move forward and push the bounds a little bit. And so within the report for each of the agencies, there's recommendations of places that maybe some of these gaps or opportunities can be filled. One of the big ones that came forward is that, within the Colorado, we're one of the 9 states that doesn't recognize or have authority in the state to be able to manage invertebrates as wildlife. And so that certainly provides a gap in having the ability to have expertise and resources and frankly pull in funding from other sources to be able to pay attention and do things that are more directed towards our invertebrates and our pollinators. And with that, you can have intent to be able to manage something, but without resources, staff positions, that it becomes less effective. So, adding or making sure the staff has dedicated expertise in positions that help manage some of the programs that could leverage, both the practices and the policy improvements is kind of critical. And then thinking about also ways that there can be collaboration between state agencies to purchase native plants and seed sources as kind of between their needs, whether that's CDOT and CPW and other agencies, the help to kind of align purchasing power, hopefully will continue to influence and support our nurseries and our seed providers that, can have, encouragement and basically, offset some of their liabilities for producing these important sources of native seed and plants that also help all of us out having access to those. And then, thinking again about where the state can leverage what we continue to understand to learn about the pollinators that we do have in our state and the conditions that they're facing. So to think about kind of survey and monitoring programs. And then also a program that has lapsed and thinking about how the state can perhaps have a bigger or, engaged role again with thinking about where we have commercial honeybee operations and opportunities to think about ways to manage those in perhaps a more sustainable and healthy way, but also in ways that work better as well for beekeepers. So programs all related to that are kind of captured in some of the highlights. So to kind of pull it all together, we ended up then thinking across the science with the management practices, okay, what recommendations can we really put forward saying, if we want to make a difference for the state, what are the things we need to focus on? And so we came up with 5 priorities, and these really kind of came together pretty naturally in looking across all the information that we collected. And, first and foremost is we know some of our pollinators are facing greater threats, have probably more risks, and also just in their nature have limited opportunities for being able to take advantage of diverse habitats, and therefore, are more imperiled or at risk, especially if they face threats or through climate change. So taking actions to protect our native imperiled pollinators was a top priority. Part of the ways we can help do that is thinking again that it's important to have state level authority for managing those at-risk pollinators, and frankly for all invertebrates as well, would be a key action item. Thinking about how we integrate better our imperiled pollinators into the State Wildlife Action Plan, because that's an incredibly important tool both for recognizing what we can do, but also for being able to solicit funding, federal funding or other funding to be able to implement actions. And then also to recognize and highlight and be attentive to there's a real risk of extinction for these pollinators, given their liabilities due to changing conditions, whether that's through climate change or other conditions that certainly would jeopardize their health. And so it's being attentive to our imperiled pollinators, but also recognizing that we've got to protect the habitats that they are dependent upon. So thinking about how do we more holistically look at the habitat needs, and especially those ones for our at-risk species are incredibly important. We've got already, good knowledge base around how we manage our fish and wildlife in this state. So we've got tools and funding programs that help direct that. How do we better integrate those and apply those same principles for our pollinators? Thinking about as we're always looking for corridors to connect spaces, it becomes that same level of importance for pollinators. And we have actually even additional tools here for pollinators in the sense that our gardens in and around our homes, the corridors along our parks and greenways, and spaces along roadways all become potentially important corridors that can connect the existing natural areas for them. So what we can do to continue to kind of encourage corridor connections becomes incredibly important, and to understand the value of those corridors for pollinators and some of the barriers, what gets in the way of those corridors being effective, are all important things that we can do to kind of address. So we need to kind of pay attention to, how we make sure the habitats are there to support our pollinators. The third priority is to address that, there are these environmental changes that are impacting our pollinators, whether that's the landscape changes or the climate changes that are occurring. And part of the landscape changes include management practice changes upon those. So thinking of ways, again, the state can have a role in reducing emissions, carbon storage, and they do have a role there, both broadly through the practices that the state has, and to kind of think about ways that they can mitigate some of those, but also be a leader, an example for other communities and for other, the residents of Colorado to follow. So they can be someone we all look to as seeing, here's the best practices that kind of help us with those reduction strategies. Similarly, is thinking about the ways we can do management practices that help to reduce risks or improve habitats. All those things are practices that when many of these actions that within the report can be implemented, can make a difference, but hopefully they can be empowering other land managers, other community members to take those same actions. The fourth priority that we kind of landed on was again, knowing for sure pesticides are a significant risk, and we've got to think about how we, can continue to reduce and mitigate from that risk. So part of that is to make sure there's some tools available to measure and track exposures, both to our managed pollinators, but also our wild bees. Certainly, we have probably better tools available to understand, what may be happening to our managed pollinators, and that may be in some ways a surrogate for us understanding some of the exposure risks for our wild bees. But having some knowledge base is really important, so we know where the level of risk, and then can take actions to figure out how best to reduce those risks, whether that's through restrictions, reductions, best practices through mitigation and timing. All of those are important, aspects around reducing the pesticide, threats to our pollinators. And then certainly through collaboration, working with research, education, all trying to make improvements there. And then the last priority was, we all, need to make sure we're continuing to monitor, know more about our wild pollinators, but also, partner and think about, we've got a role here too for our managed pollinators as well. We both have, very similar outcomes, and we need to explore more of those, again, about how do we maintain healthy populations for both, and making sure there's abundant forage for both, and where those interactions may occur and where those interactions may not be helpful, how do we better think about ways we can be sustainable, both with how we create habitat for our wild pollinators and also adequate habitat for our managed pollinators. So those 5 priorities kind of are the chief outcomes. There's a lot of actions that hopefully will move forward through, and I think I look forward to kind of this report maybe leading to a lot more changes, and I know Joyce will cover here some of the actions that are immediately forthcoming based upon some of these information. So hopefully that whets your appetite to dig in a little bit further.
Thanks so much, Adrian and Steve. I see we're getting a little short on time, and there's so many good questions. I hope we can get to some of them. I'll keep this pretty quick, but just a little history. Probably about 6 or 7 years ago, PPAN identified a gap in the state level protection or authority over pollinators and insects more broadly when we were meeting with CPW and DNR, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and Department of Natural Resources. And really in those meetings, there was kind of a light that went on like, oh, wow, yeah, that is a gap. It's kind of a funny one. You think, well, insects really should be considered as wildlife, but at the official state level, they are not. So we did work with DNR on kind of the first step administrative order to start thinking about this pollinator sort of what can the state do? And of course, the authors also saw through this study, saw this gap in authority over invertebrates to be a major policy gap. And in the study, they recommend that the state really take some role in this and help to manage pollinators, insects, and rare plants that would support. And as of course, they depend on one another. So that's an important element of this. And as a result, we're excited to say that the DNR is leading a new House bill, and that's House Bill 1117. And it's titled, and this is a little long, Concerning Certain Species Under the Authority of State Agencies That Regulate Parks and Wildlife. And I just refer to it as the Invert and Rare Plants Bill for short. So with passage of this bill, invertebrates and rare plant species could be studied, conserved, and it would also require the General Assembly to make an appropriation of funding for this work. So those are all good things. I think the bill had its second reading on the House floor today. I'm not sure. I didn't get a chance to check. But if the bill gets through the House, it will soon move on to a Senate committee. So keep your eyes out for that. And also important to note that the budget associated with this bill will allow for CPW to conduct studies of invertebrates and rare plants. And this will help to determine the conservation and management measures that are needed, and then they can better design programs to conserve and protect them. So we're encouraging you all to support this bill, and Anna Gray has the bill number there. And I think I'm going to jump right over to Anna Gray. Maybe we can manage a couple questions.
Definitely. Thank you again, Adrian and Steve and Joyce, for such wonderful presentations. We will try to get to all these questions. I'll try to address some that have not already been answered in the chat. So the first one would be, have you had outreach from public or private land managers about your policy recommendations, as that could be really applicable to Boulder County's draft weed management plan?
I'll jump in just a little bit in the sense that, you know, our scope really was focusing on the state. So we did try to integrate that through the consultation we had with state staff and certainly with Xerces and even with some of the scientists and the practices who have worked with landowners over time, but we have not done didn't really have the ability to outreach specifically through this study to local level, you know, officials or programs. That was just beyond the scope of what we could get. I think this is an opportunity to move forward, though, to think about those ways it can be applicable and to maybe be always a future addendum to the study to think about that aspect.
I've spoken with a couple of county board members or commissioners about various issues around county level management, in at least my informed opinion from working on the study, but so far no coordinated kind of efforts around that.
Great, thank you. The next question is, would seeding native flowers at a higher elevation than they are currently appearing be a viable approach for helping pollinators in their upward migration?
Yeah, so this is one of the things I point out in the scientific review specific to climate change, is that while Colorado is home of some of the best research on the impacts of climate change, there's almost nothing known about how we can mitigate those impacts on high elevation species. And so brainstorm anything. If we could plant in high alpine environments, it could potentially be a viable solution in some areas. We just don't know because no one's actually tried to do it yet. So
Great, thank you. Our next question is someone's wondering if you all have any thoughts on the use of indaziflam, a persistent herbicide used by OSPM and Boulder County Open Space.
Boy, it's a tricky subject. You know, it came up just in our conversation with the state because the state does have some places that they are using it on in the treatment of cheatgrass. And I think they're struggling with the scale of what they're trying to do with, you know, managing cheatgrass or other problem plants, but also the kind of the results they're seeing. So I won't draw any conclusions from that, but I know it is kind of an ongoing conversation and something the state, like all of us, are very interested in understanding the risks behind it, but also understanding the potential benefits from a certain site too.
yeah,
Great.
and the big thing with any herbicides is that most of the long-term consequences remain unknown. And so while there have been published studies on indaziflam showing short-term reductions in cheatgrass encroachment, there's also long-term studies which have shown a suppression in native plant regeneration following treatment 5 years post-application. And so the question is, are the long-term consequences of using a short-term solution outweighing the short-term benefit of controlling cheatgrass? That's still up for debate.
Thank you. Our next question was pretty popular in the chat. Is there a conclusion about the impact of non-native plants on our native pollinators? As in, do our native pollinators use non-native plants as effectively as the native species? And is this a generalist pollinators thing only, or does it include specialist pollinators as well?
Yeah, so there's actually some recent research out of CSU, for instance, which has looked at the resources that some of our impaired bumblebees use. And by far, musk thistle is one of the most dominant floral resources that they're using to reproduce, right? And so the reality is most of our non-native flowers have been here long enough that our native pollinators, in some instances, have adapted to use them. And what I take away from that is that if we have plant policies to remove invasive species, we should have concurrent policies to replace them with something else that's a viable alternative. And so it's a complex network of non-native and native pollinator interactions, and we really need a little more work to know how they interact.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we probably have time for one more question. And people are wondering about any thoughts on integrating soil health and water management into the pollinator focus along with electronic waves as creating issues for migration. Sorry, that's kind of a lot.
I'll take a stab at the first part of that in the sense that within some of the management practices, you will get a nod to the importance of, you know, thinking about our soil health. So whether that's within the agricultural recommendations or frankly, even in the forest management, thinking about the way we manage our forests and some of the equipment, trying to mitigate or reduce the amount of disturbance to the soils are practices that you'll find, you know, threaded throughout the management recommendations. But I think again, that's an area, you know, again, might be really helpful to in the future dive into that even more. There just weren't, from a capacity standpoint, a lot of ways we could delve into that in any rich detail. I don't know if you have anything to say in the second part of that question, Adrian.
Sure. I mean, it's fun to think about. So the reality is that many of our pollinators probably can perceive electronic signals. And so we know, for instance, that bumblebees can detect charge changes on flowers and know whether or not a bumblebee has already been to that flower or not. What we don't know is if any of the electromagnetic radiation that we create in everything from our cell phones to our cell towers has any impact on that perception. We just don't know. It's really hard to even design a study that could isolate that kind of stuff. And so whether it has impacts on migration or other behaviors is simply an unknown.
Great. Thank you so much. We are past the hour. So apologies if we did not get to your question. You are welcome to reach out to PPAN with those and we can maybe pass them along. But thank you again, Adrian and Steve, and to all. Yeah, thank you.
You.
For having us.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.